The interactive dialogue on the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka. In accordance with the Council Resolution 46/1, it is my honor to welcome back to the podium Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, Acting High Commissioner for Human Rights. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. Nada, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Distinguished President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Further to Human Rights Council Resolution 46/1, I present my office's comprehensive report on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. Since our previous written update in March 2022, the country has been suffering from an unprecedented economic crisis where inflation has reached 66.7% in past months. For months now, Sri Lankans have been facing severe shortage of fuel, electricity, food, medicines, and other essential items. 6.3 million people are estimated to be food insecure. These realities have impaired people's right to food, health, education, and work. We welcome the government's commitment to provide social protection for the most vulnerable and encourage member states and international financial institutions to ensure that Sri Lanka has fiscal space to fulfill its core economic and social rights obligations in this regard. Meanwhile, in a powerful expression of the indivisibility of rights, the country also witnessed remarkable and unprecedented mass protests demanding change to Sri Lanka's political landscape. People from different socio-economic, cultural, ethnic and religious backgrounds came together to call for deep political and democratic reforms, as well as accountability for economic mismanagement and corruption. Months of countrywide protests eventually led to the president's resignation on 14 July. A new president was elected by the Sri Lankan parliament on 20 July 2022. Sri Lanka has navigated these changes in a largely peaceful way and in accordance with its constitution, but the political and economic situation remains fragile and the potential for further instability remains. The broad-based demands by Sri Lankans from all communities, in particular youth, for accountability and democratic reforms present an important starting point for a new and common vision for the future of Sri Lanka. I encourage the new government to embark on a national dialogue to advance human rights and reconciliation and to carry out the deeper institutional, democratic and security sector reforms needed to restore the independence of key institutions, to combat impunity, to prevent the recurrence of human rights violations and to tackle the economic crisis. In doing so, it is essential that the government ensures an environment that respects and promotes free expression, peaceful assembly and inclusive democratic participation. Of concern in recent weeks, scores of leaders and members of the protest movement and trade unions have been arrested. Particularly troubling was the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act to arrest 3 student leaders on 18 August. Despite the government's announcement in June 2022 that it has been applying the de facto moratorium on the use of this act since March of this year. I urge the government not to revert to this reliance on draconian security laws, but to take positive action to foster an environment for peaceful protest, critical discussion and debate. The government has a fresh opportunity to steer the country on the path towards justice and reconciliation and to address the legacy of conflict. I welcome in this regard the tone set by the President in his first speech to Parliament, in which he recognized the diversity of the Sri Lankan nation and promised constitutional reforms. Also, I was pleased to discuss with the government potential areas of cooperation, including the drafting of a new counter-terrorism law to replace the PTA, and in the area of transitional justice and the strengthening of institutions. Successfully delivering on these promises requires also a break from the past. This involves security sector reforms to remove military officials or former paramilitary leaders implicated in past human rights violations to increase transparency and ensure accountability. The continuation of land disputes, mainly related to Buddhist heritage conservation at Hindu or Muslim sites, or expansion of military installations in the northern and eastern provinces has further jeopardized reconciliation and created new tensions. Continued reports of surveillance and intimidation of civil society organizations, victim groups, human rights defenders, journalists, and former cadre of the LTTE by police, military and intelligence services are of concern. Without fundamental security sector reforms and the demilitarization of the North and the East, this pervasive culture of surveillance and oppression will not end. 13 years since the end of the war, tens of thousands of survivors and their families continue to seek justice and the truth about the fate of their loved ones. They remain in need of reparations. The Sri Lankan state has repeatedly failed to pursue an effective transitional justice process and uphold victims' rights to truth, justice and reparations. Rather, as described in our previous reports, successive governments have created political obstacles to accountability, actively promoted and incorporated some military and former paramilitary officials credibly implicated in alleged war crimes into the highest levels of government, and have failed to present a shared understanding of the conflict and its root causes. Similarly, despite some suspects being charged, there has been no further progress to establish the truth about the terrible Easter Sunday bombings of 2019. OHCHR calls for an independent and transparent investigation with international assistance should it be necessary to pursue further lines of inquiry. In particular, the role of the security establishment in a process that guarantees the full participation of victims and their representatives. It is the hope of this office that the government will now seize the opportunity offered by the changed circumstances in the country to re-embark on these fundamental processes that promote national reconciliation by ensuring accountability for past human rights violations and abuses. In the absence of current and effective accountability options in Sri Lanka, the High Commissioner has called on states to pursue alternate strategies to advance the accountability at the international level, including through consideration of targeted sanctions against alleged perpetrators, as well as cooperation to initiate prosecutions on the basis of extraterritorial and universal jurisdiction. The team established in my office to advance accountability pursuant to Resolution 46.1, paragraph 6, has made important progress. It has conducted proactive, investigative and analytical work, including in relation to gender and child-related violations, and is consolidating information and evidence collected by the United Nations and other bodies and entities into a repository which will assist future accountability initiatives. OHCHR will continue to place victims at the heart of this work. This includes seeking to minimize security risks faced by those who speak out about past violations. As the High Commissioner noted to the 49th session of the Council, the scale and type of this accountability work requires adequate time, financial resources and support by states. I therefore urge this Council to ensure that this important work is appropriately reinforced. Impunity remains a central obstacle to the rule of law, reconciliation and Sri Lanka's sustainable peace and development. This impunity continues to embolden those committing human rights violations and has created fertile ground for corruption and the abuse of power, as well as contributing to the present economic crisis. The mandate granted by this Council under Resolution 46.1 to continue monitoring the human rights situation and pursue accountability for crimes under international law is now more important than ever and responds to the broad-based aspirations for change being expressed by Sri Lankans from all communities. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you for your presentation. De acuerdo con nuestra práctica.
In accordance with our practice, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned.
To His Excellency, Honorable Ali Sabri, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka, thank you for being here with us. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Madam Acting High Commissioner, Excellencies, at the outset, I reiterate Sri Lanka's unwavering commitment towards advancing, securing and protecting the human rights of our people and continuing our engagement with the Council in a spirit of cooperation and dialogue. In keeping with our commitment, notwithstanding our categorical rejection of Resolution 46.1, we have submitted Sri Lanka's detailed written response to the High Commissioner's report. Mr. President, we remain cognizant of and acutely sensitive to the events that have taken place in the recent past. The severe economic crisis emanating from factors both internal and external offer many lessons for all. We recall in this context the indivisibility of human rights as enshrined in the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action. The government is extremely sensitive to the socio-economic hardship faced by our people and has initiated immediate multi-pronged measures to ensure their well-being through a provision of supplies essential to the life of the community. A staff-level agreement has been reached with the International Monetary Fund and discussions on debt restructuring are in progress. The government is in dialogue with the UN agencies as well as bilateral partners to protect the most vulnerable from the adverse impact of the crisis. The recent changes that have taken place bear testimony to our continued commitment to upholding our long-standing democratic principles and norms. The constitutional right to peacefully assembly and expression guaranteed the democratic space for our people to exercise their right. In this regard, transgressions of the law resulting in criminal and unlawful activity were addressed in accord with the law and the Constitution. In circumstances where such freedoms were abused by elements with vested interests to achieve undemocratic political ends. Mr. President, notwithstanding the severe constraints and challenges, Sri Lanka remains firmly committed to pursuing tangible progress in the protection of human rights and reconciliation through independent domestic institutions. Sri Lanka, along with several members of this Council, have opposed Resolution 46/1, fundamentally disagreeing with its legitimacy and objectives. We have consistently highlighted that the contents of the resolution, its operative paragraph 6 in particular, violates the sovereignty of the people of Sri Lanka and the principle of the UN Charter. Once again, we are compelled to categorically reject any follow-up measures to the resolution as well as the related recommendation and conclusion by the High Commissioner. Mr. President, it is observed that the High Commissioner's report makes extensive reference to economic crimes. Apart from the ambiguity of the term, it is a matter of concern that such reference exceeds the mandate of the OHCHR. In this context, we recall the paramount importance of adhering to UNGA Resolution 60/251, 48/141, and the IB package. The proposed 22nd amendments to the Constitution introduces several salient changes which would strengthen the democratic governance and independent oversight of key institutions and combat corruption, including through the constitutional recognition of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Mr. President, measures aimed at promoting reconciliation and human rights, if they are to be meaningful and sustainable, must be based on cooperation with the country concerned, be compatible with the aspiration of its people, and being consonant with its basic legal framework. We endeavour to establish a credible truth-seeking mechanism within the framework of the Constitution. The contours of a model that would suit the particular conditions of Sri Lanka are under discussion. The recommendation of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry have resulted in progressive amendment to the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the release of the detainees. Further recommendations are awaited. As we delivered on the onerous task of review and reform of the PTA this year, to further enhance human rights, we will replace the PTA with a more comprehensive national security legislation in accordance with the international best practices. The recent delisting of groups and individuals will provide further impetus for the constructive dialogue. We will continue to provide the necessary support and resources to strengthen the functioning of independent domestic mechanisms, including the Office of the Missing Persons, the Office for Reparation, the Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, and the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. The outreach to the overseas Sri Lankans encompassing all communities will be expanded through the establishment of an Office for Overseas Sri Lankans. Mr. President, in upholding human rights, we have benefited from the considerable expertise available with other countries as well as the United Nations. We will seek further advice and support on best practices as we proceed and as deemed necessary. Sri Lanka has maintained regular and constructive engagement with the UN treaty bodies, the special procedures and universal periodic review process. We look forward to proactively engage in the upcoming UPR 4th cycle. We have facilitated 2 visits by the Office of High Commissioner to Sri Lanka this year and provided unimpeded access. Mr. President, it is 13 years since the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka, and since then, a new generation has emerged with their own aspirations. While issues of reconciliation and accountability are being comprehensively addressed through a domestic process, it is time to reflect realistically on the trajectory of this resolution, which has continued on the agenda of the Council for over a decade, and to undertake a realistic assessment on whether it has benefited the people of Sri Lanka. There is a need to acknowledge actual progress on the ground and support Sri Lanka. The current challenges, though formidable, have provided us with a unique opportunity to work towards institutional changes for the betterment of our people. In a message of unity and reconciliation, President Ranil Wickremesinghe, in his inaugural address to the Parliament, said, I quote, "If we come together, we'll be able to invigorate the nation," unquote. Mr. President, the people of Sri Lanka remains steadfast and resilient while upholding their democratic values as one of Asia's oldest democracies. We are not hesitant to acknowledge our challenges and forge ahead with renewed vigor. While our immediate concern is economic recovery, advancing human rights of our people is of equal priority. We look to the genuine support and understanding of this Council as we proceed on this path. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your presence and your intervention. Comenzamos ahora.
We now start with the interactive dialogue, and I give the floor, first of all, to the Netherlands on behalf of a group of countries. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to you. I'm honored to deliver the statement on behalf of the 3 countries of the Benelux, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And we align ourselves with the statement by the EU that will be delivered in a short while. We thank OHCHR for its report on the human rights situation on Sri Lanka and would like to express our sympathy to the people of Sri Lanka who face unprecedented hardship. Economic recovery can only be meaningful when it is accompanied by institutional and political reform, including accountability for embedded impunity of past and present human rights violations, economic crimes and endemic corruption. In this regard, the Benelux countries welcomed the formation of a more inclusive government and constitutional reform. However, we are concerned about infringements on freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, the failure to achieve tangible results with regard to accountability for past human rights violations and abuses, and about the militarization of civilian government functions. We call on the government of Sri Lanka to adhere to its international human rights obligations, to engage constructively with the protest movements, and to establish an inclusive process towards reform that is supported by all parts of the population, including minorities. To conclude, I want to kindly ask the High Commissioner to elaborate on the obstacles preventing an effective transitional justice process. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to Finland on behalf of a group of countries. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I have the honor to make this statement on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. We thank the Acting High Commissioner for this update. We acknowledge the difficult circumstances Sri Lanka finds itself in. However, such circumstances should be also viewed as an opportunity to undertake much-needed reforms, ensuring inclusiveness. We are concerned by the lack of progress in the areas of transitional justice, accountability and reconciliation, and encourage the government to demonstrate progress. Establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be a welcome start. We are deeply dismayed at the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act against student activists. We urge Sri Lanka to repeal the PTA and, in the interim, stop its use. We urge Sri Lanka to protect the freedom of expression and assembly for all, including persons belonging to minorities, and to stop arbitrary arrests of persons engaging in peaceful protests. We call upon Sri Lanka to cooperate fully with the OHCHR. I thank you.
Thank you. Informo que la...
I would like to inform you that the list of speakers is now closed. We are going to interrupt the list of speakers for this interactive dialogue to invite, before concluding this morning's meeting, His Excellency Mr. Alfonso Tse Mukui, third Prime Minister in charge of Human Rights of Equatorial Guinea, to address the Council. You have the floor. Sir, thank you very much, Mr. President. On behalf of the Government of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, we thank and congratulate the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the presentation of her report. We have heard with satisfaction about the activities that the office under your leadership has moved forward on, and the way in which it has promoted many projects to promote, defend, and guarantee human rights. I convey to you the greetings of harmony, solidarity, and peace sent by the President of the Republic, Head of State and the Government, His Excellency Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, to this 51st session of the Human Rights Council. Mr. President, we recognize the fact